123 million pounds worldwide in the 90s to about 1.8 billion pounds used now. It's found pervasively in food, water, air, soil, found in our own bodies. USGS, part of the Department of Interior, has documented it in rainfall. It is ubiquitous and pervasive in our lives. But again, this is about more than glyphosate. Pesticides generally, I call this some not-so-fun facts, I suppose. About 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used in the United States each year.
Welcome to Cambridge Forum in Harvard Square. Thank you for joining us on this cool autumn evening to discuss an important topic, Monsanto. Actually, its new name is even smaller, Bayer. The giant German pharmaceutical company has bought them out. They did that in May. And instantly, this new giant biotech conglomerate became the world's largest seed and pesticide company. As noted by Forbes, its history, products, and culture will linger. Bayer cannot change Monsanto's history. And it is that history that we're going to focus on tonight, namely Monsanto's widely used weed killer, RoundUp, a product which has been used globally for the past 40 years in food production, and which is now linked to cancer. I'm Mary Stack, the director of Cambridge Forum, and tonight we have with us Carey Gillam, investigative journalist and author of Whitewash, The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer, and the Corruption of Science. Carey will be joined in the discussion by Professor Sheldon Krimsky from the Urban and Environmental Policy Department at Tufts University. Professor Krimsky has a new book coming out in the spring entitled GMOs Decoded, A Skeptic's View of Genetically Modified Food. Today, two interesting stories hit the headlines with regard to glyphosate. That's the active ingredient in RoundUp. CNN reported that dozens of common breakfast cereals and snack bars had been found to contain glyphosate, a controversial herbicide which is now linked to cancer. Two, a California judge denied Monsanto's request to overturn the guilty verdict, which had been ruled against them in a landmark case several weeks ago. It instead upheld a jury's verdict that Monsanto's popular weed killer, RoundUp, A, caused the cancer of the terminal patient, and B, failed to warn him of the dangers of using it. The plaintiff, a former groundskeeper, DeWayne Lee Johnston, who's dying from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, told The Guardian, "I hope they get the message, Monsanto, that people in America and across the world are not ignorant. They have already done their own research. I hope people get the picture and start to make decisions about what they eat and what they spray on their farms." Tonight's guest, Carey Gillam, lives in the farm state of Kansas with her 3 children and says it is children that are driving the force behind her writing and research into the health and environmental impact of food production. She spent 17 years with Reuters International News Agency before becoming director of the nonprofit US Right to Know in 2016. This is an organization which aims to pursue truth and transparency in America's food system. Let's give a warm welcome to Carey Gillam.
On the plane ride here this morning from Kansas City, I sat next to a baseball fan who was on his way here to go to the World Series, and he asked what I was coming for, and I explained it to him, and he said, if anyone actually turned out tonight, it would be a group of nerds. So thank you. I'm gratified that there are nerds here in Cambridge, so I appreciate you coming out. Maybe we won't be very long if we can catch the end of the game. I am a journalist. I've been a journalist for 30 years, covering corporate America. The last 20 of those I've spent covering food and agriculture. I was assigned to that beat in 1998 by the global newswire Reuters. At that time, agriculture was going through a pretty profound change. Monsanto had just introduced genetically engineered crops. These Roundup-ready crops were designed to encourage and be used in conjunction with, of course, Monsanto's Roundup herbicide. And it was, changing the way that farmers produced our food and changing a lot of traditional agricultural practices. So it was my job to learn everything I could about that, spend time with farmers in their fields and food companies, time with scientists and grain handlers, and time with Monsanto in its headquarters, which I did many, many times, meeting with their scientists and corporate executives and marketing professionals. And it was also my job to learn about their rivals and the competition in the marketplace. Of course, as I did my research and became more familiar with this industry, I came to follow the science as it emerged about the impacts of this chemical glyphosate, which was used in Roundup. And the research has evolved very distinctly over 20 years, and a lot of that is what I lay out in the book. But the reason that I actually wrote the book was not so much about Monsanto and Roundup, but really because over these 20 years of research and covering food and farming, I came to sort of the knowledge, the realization, what the data shows us is that we have created a really profound problem for ourselves with a pesticide-dependent food system here in the United States. The health professionals around the world have been warning us and publishing scientific papers and different documents and opinion pieces trying to alert us, regulators, consumers, others, to the dangers that this pesticide-dependent food system poses, both for environmental health and for human health. But what we're seeing is a handful of really powerful corporations, Monsanto, Bayer, DuPont, Dow, Syngenta, pushing the messaging that we should not worry about that the rewards of these pesticides and the specialty seeds far outweigh the risks, and that we should not listen to the health experts who are trying to warn us about future dangers, but we should trust them even as they reap the billions of dollars in revenues every year off the sale of these. So glyphosate and Monsanto, I say, is really the poster child, I think. It's the narrative thread through my book. Other people say tip of the iceberg, but it's not just one pesticide, it's not just one company that we need to be aware of and educated about. We need to really fully understand this so that we can make the changes and be informed and engaged in public policy that protects public health and not corporate profits. As I said, bulk of my research, the narrative thread in this book is about glyphosate. You probably already know about it since you're nerds, but 1974 is when Monsanto introduced glyphosate to the world, a novel herbicide, worked very efficiently, very effectively, killing a broad range of weeds. It's used not only by farmers in their fields, but golf course operators use it. It's used by, governments in forestry management, utility right-of-ways. It's used by school districts and city councils and parks and playgrounds where children play. And of course, many homeowners use it on their lawns and in their gardens. The most widely used herbicide in history. We've gone from 40 million pounds approximately in the 1990s to about 300 million pounds used now in the United States. 123 million pounds worldwide in the 90s to about 1.8 billion pounds used now. It's found pervasively in food, water, air, soil, found in our own bodies. USGS, part of the Department of Interior, has documented it in rainfall. It is ubiquitous and pervasive in our lives. But again, this is about more than glyphosate. Pesticides generally, I call this some not-so-fun facts, I suppose. About 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used in the United States each year. Approximately 5.6 billion pounds of pesticides are used worldwide annually. The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates that approximately 50 million people in the U.S. obtain their drinking water from groundwater that is potentially contaminated with pesticides and other agricultural chemicals. And 90% of Americans show pesticide residues in their blood and urine, according to biomonitoring by our CDC. A team of scientists here at Harvard recently, just this week, are joining the chorus of people warning that we need more study, better understanding of what these pesticides are doing to their health. The team of Harvard scientists were among those who published a paper earlier this year that showed pesticide residues are tied to reproductive problems, fertility issues in human health, pesticide exposures through the diet and through drinking water. They're saying that we have an urgent need to act on this and to get better educated. One of the ties that we hear a lot about when we talk about pesticides is cancer, one of the outcomes, and that certainly is one of the concerns. It's something that's very near to me. I don't know about the rest of you in the audience. Usually I ask people for a show of hands if you know someone close to you who has had cancer or died of cancer. Usually almost every hand goes up. Myself, relatives, friends, neighbors, a good friend who died last December. My son's 16-year-old friend, a football player, diagnosed last year with cancer. The statistics now are 1 in every 2 men will get cancer in their lifetime, 1 in every 3 women here in the United States. Our National Toxicology Program has been warning us. They put out a report in 2016 and said we need to not only focus on how to treat it, how to pop a pill or cut off a body part or radiate ourselves. We need to focus on how to prevent it, and understanding environmental contaminants, pesticides is a big part of that. We are poisoning ourselves. So back to the poster child, glyphosate. As you probably know, in 2015, there was big news out of the World Health Organization. This is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, a group of scientists from around the world who come together regularly to examine the scientific literature on different substances that are thought to have the potential to be carcinogenic. They looked at glyphosate, they looked at epidemiology and toxicology. Again, they did not do new research, they looked at research that had been done and published over many years. And they classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen based on a range of these studies. What happened next, of course, was this explosion of litigation. You heard a little bit about that from Mary. About 8,500 people estimated are now suing Monsanto, claiming that RoundUp or other glyphosate-based herbicides, not glyphosate by itself, but the actual formulated products, which include other ingredients, have caused them to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and that Monsanto has long known about the dangers and has suppressed the information and failed to warn them. And the first trial concluded with a jury verdict on August 10th of $289 million, $250 million of that, which was in punitive damages. You may have seen in the news the judge on October 22nd, Monday, reduced the punitive damages to $39 million. But she let the verdict stand. And the jurors, it was a unanimous verdict. The jurors looked at scientific evidence that was presented to them by both sides, of course. Monsanto had a team of attorneys to present the science that they say indicates that glyphosate and Roundup products are not carcinogenic, and the plaintiffs presented the science that they said indicates that it is. But additionally, what has come out of the litigation, which has been so fascinating for a reporter, are the internal Monsanto documents that many people have come to refer to as the Monsanto Papers. And these are millions of pages of records that Monsanto has turned over in discovery, internal emails and reports and strategy, communications. And what has been revealed is not just science, but how Monsanto works to manipulate the science, to hide the science, to suppress the science, to harass outside scientists who try to warn about risks that they see in the studies, to harass journalists, to fund front groups, to carry the water for them, appearing to be independent while actually taking direction, marching orders from Monsanto. There have been a lot of documents like that really lay out deceptive tactics. I call it decades of deception. And it begs the question to a certain extent, if this product really is so very safe, why would you need to go to such lengths to try to hide it, to try to deceive consumers and lawmakers, manipulate regulators? I don't have enough time, and sometimes in some of my presentations I'll have a PowerPoint and I'll show you some of these emails and memos, but there are vast volumes of these. And I wrote an article for The Guardian that said, really, Monsanto was undone by its own words. The science is compelling, but the evidence of the lack of concern for consumers, the lack of concern for human health, the concern for how do we manipulate, how do we ghostwrite, those are their own words, ghostwrite, we want to ghostwrite this scientific report. When you see that laid out, it resonates, and it resonated with the jury. I think we're going to see more of that, of course. We have 10 more trials that are currently set for 2019. There are going to be many more coming about. Monsanto has vowed to appeal. Bayer shareholders are taking a real beating, though, right now because the share price has plummeted. It was down again this week. So this is something that's going to go on for many years, and we don't know yet how the litigation is going to play out, but it certainly has raised awareness around the world. The exposure of these documents has garnered attention in Europe and Australia and South Africa and South America, Canada. I've gotten calls from all over the world. People are really concerned about this. So one example, I wrote this down so I wouldn't forget because Sheldon and I talked about this quite a bit, but one example of the ghostwriting, which is out there right now, which I think is particularly compelling and people should be aware of, Monsanto really wanted to discredit the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They actually talked about it before this IARC group met, before the IARC group even classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. You can see in their internal documents, they talk about that they expect that glyphosate will be classified that way. They expect it will be classified as a probable or a possible human carcinogen, and they lay out a plan about how they're going to go after these scientists and try to discredit them. One of the ways that they decided they wanted to do this was they wanted to publish a series of papers that would discredit IARC, that would contradict IARC and say how wrong it was. But of course, they didn't want these papers to look like they came from Monsanto. They wanted them to look like they were independent. And in fact, these papers were published in the Critical Reviews in Toxicology in 2016, and these papers were called an independent review. And they came out and found IARC to be completely wrong. In the acknowledgments for these papers, they state no one from Monsanto reviewed at all these documents, had anything to do with these manuscripts before they were published in terms of reviewing them. But what you see in the internal Monsanto emails is not only did they review them, not only did they directly pay some of the authors secretly in arrangements that were not disclosed, but they actually had a very heavy hand in drafting and editing and writing parts of these papers. That information was so compelling that the editors of the journal just recently wrote an expression of concern and had Monsanto and some of the scientists whose names were on those papers do a new acknowledgement and a new declaration of interest. But the papers are still out there, and they actually haven't even changed the name. They're still calling them an independent review. So all of this, what all of this has led to, and I could talk more about ghostwriting. There's evidence of, academic scientists from around the country whose names and likenesses are on websites with articles underneath that look independent, look like they came from this professor. We see in the internal Monsanto documents that it was a PR firm from Monsanto that actually wrote the copy that's underneath the name of this professor. Gosh, we could go on and on. Different front groups are set up to attack scientists, journalists. I'm on many different websites with attack blogs and things written about me. There's a website set up called Deniers for Hire. I'm on it. I don't know if you're on it yet. A couple reporters from the New York Times are on it, different scientists. Anybody who speaks out, raises an alarm bell, gets hammered on social media and through blogs and through front groups. It's a very aggressive strategy to try to control the narrative. One point of evidence about how Monsanto manipulates the regulatory system, which I've included in the book and also is documented in Freedom of Information requests and internal Monsanto documents. Our ATSDR, which is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, it's part of Health and Human Services, kind of a sister agency to CDC, they wanted to look at the toxicity of glyphosate in 2015. Monsanto did not want them to do that. And what you see in the documents is Monsanto talking internally about how worried they are. They don't want ATSDR to review it. They want to reach out to the EPA and see if they can get the EPA officials, their friendly EPA officials, to help them make that review go away, make it not happen. And it's really fascinating because you see, and they emailed Jim Jones, the head of the Office of Pesticide Programs, and say, we've got to talk about this review. He immediately emails his deputy, a second in command. All of these email exchanges go on, and the ATSDR review goes away. And that's just one example of how they have been so powerful within our regulatory agency. So what all of this has done and why it is so meaningful is because with the suppression of science, with the manipulation of the scientific record, there are many examples of ghostwriting that we don't have time to get into tonight. With all of the marketing of the pesticides and telling consumers and farmers and others that they don't need to worry about these scientific studies, these junk science studies, what we've seen, of course, is an explosion of pesticide residues in our foods. And I think you did touch on some of the news today. We saw more information about glyphosate residues in oat products was what they were talking about today. Interestingly enough, our FDA, there's a chemist at the FDA who found glyphosate residues in a range of oatmeal products in 2016. I write about him in my book. He pulled baby food from store shelves, oatmeal products that we feed to our young children, and he found glyphosate at very worrisome levels in all of them, and notified his supervisors at the FDA about that. You won't find that published in any FDA report. He also sampled honey from around the United States, even organic honey, and found glyphosate levels, again, at very high levels, at what would be considered illegally high levels, except no level in the United States is really considered legal at this point. And again, supervisors kind of told him to just go away and be quiet, and you will not find that information in any published report by the FDA. It's been a particular... I'm getting a bit off track, I suppose, but it's been a particular sticking point with me, and I do write about it quite a bit in my book because the FDA and the USDA are responsible for testing foods every year, specifically for pesticide residues. They've been doing this for decades. Consumers may not be aware of residues in the foods, but our regulatory agencies certainly are. For all of these years, they have skipped testing for glyphosate, even though it's the most widely used herbicide in agriculture. It was only in 2016, after the Government Accountability Office criticized the USDA and the FDA for failing to test for glyphosate, that the FDA said, okay, we'll start to do some limited testing. And they finally just did release earlier this month, as part of a very large report, a very small amount of information about the glyphosate testing. They did not include information about the oatmeal. They did not include information about honey. They did not include a memo that I have a copy of from inside the FDA, another FDA chemist who is talking to his supervisor saying he's finding glyphosate in granola and wheat crackers, and he says he's bringing food from home, and he's finding glyphosate in everything. The only thing he can't find it in is broccoli, according to this memo. So, this, again, is the poster child for this problem that we have with pesticide residues in foods. And you hear a lot about glyphosate, I think, in food because it is Monsanto, and because, it's newsy and that sort of thing. But there's so many other pesticides. Our newest information from the FDA says about 50% of our vegetables, close to 80% of fruits are carrying pesticide residues. Overall, about 50% of the foods being consumed by Americans, as sampled by the FDA, contain pesticide residues. And again, these are residues of chemicals, pesticides, that are tied to cancers and diseases and neurodevelopmental problems and immune system problems. One of them is called Chlorpyrifos, a real nerdy name here, but that's an insecticide marketed by Dow Chemical. It's known to cause neurodevelopmental damage to children. The science is so foundational behind that it's been banned from household use. The EPA has said it is no longer considered safe at any level in food or water. It was supposed to be banned from agriculture last year, but Dow Chemical and CropLife America lobbied the new Trump administration so heavily and convinced them to drop the ban. And so chlorpyrifos is still in our food. This is one of the chemicals that scientists are so worried about because it is so dangerous and so damaging to children, and the primary exposure is through diet. It's one of the top 10 most prevalent pesticides found in our foods today, according to the FDA. And again, this is a very good example of how we're letting corporate interests and corporate profits take precedent over concerns about public health. The regulators and the chemical companies continue to tell us, separate from chlorpyrifos, because no level is safe, but for things like glyphosate and other pesticides, they're telling us that as long as it's within a certain level, as long as it's within what we call a tolerance or a maximum residue limit, don't worry about it, you'll be fine. And that's what we've been told. That's what we were told about chlorpyrifos until these most recent years. But what's happening with all of that information about the MRLs is the science is catching up, and the science is saying, not really. It's not only chlorpyrifos for which this MRL system is deeply flawed. It's the whole system of pesticide residues. This is part of what the Harvard scientists are trying to warn us about. I have a quote, if I can read this to you, from Dr. Chavreau. No, this is not the right quote, sorry. That's in the story that I was writing today. But again, he and others are saying that we need very urgently much more study. Linda Birnbaum, who's the head of our NIEHS and the head of our National Toxicology Program, has also come out and said we need much more urgent information and that these levels could no longer be considered safe. So what I'm hoping to do, I guess, with the book and with all of the presentations that I make like this tonight is sort of bring us back to a time when we were engaged and aware and we were trying to make a difference in public policy and be protective of public health, and go way back to Rachel Carson, right, and Silent Spring. And her book, warned us, and she used DDT sort of as the narrative. DDT, by the way, is still found in our food, according to the most recent FDA report. But she warned us about the indiscriminate use of pesticides and warned us that if we did not understand fully the risks that came with the rewards, that we were creating large and profound and lasting problems for our environment and for our children's future. And the point that I'm trying to make in Whitewash is that while we listened and we seemed to pay attention to that, we created the Environmental Protection Agency, a lot of environmental defense organizations came into being, we seem to have forgotten that lesson, and the balance has swung too far the other way, and we need to get back in balance. Yes, there are rewards with pesticides, but there are also very real risks, and unless we do something about those, we cannot stay on this pesticide-dependent treadmill forever. We're already seeing soil degradation, we're seeing weed resistance, we're seeing insect resistance, we're seeing farmers throughout the Midwest who were using glyphosate and have no concerns about it, but now it just doesn't work that well, and so they're piling on dicamba and 2,4-D and other herbicides. It's not a system that is sustainable. So if I have time to read this quote from Rachel Carson, yes. If having endured much, we have at last asserted our right to know, and if by knowing we have concluded that we are being asked to take senseless and frightening risks, then we should no longer accept the counsel of those who tell us that we must fill our world with poisonous chemicals. We should look about and see what other course is open to us. And that's the message of Whitewash, and that is the message that I'm here tonight to carry forth. And as I say in the first pages of Whitewash, it's not a feel-good story. A lot of people read it. I haven't had one person yet read it and say, I love that book. They usually say, oh, it makes me angry, it makes me frustrated, it makes me not want to eat food. It's not a feel-good story, but it's a story that has to be told. So thank you for letting me share that with you tonight. I appreciate it.
Good journalists like Carey Gillam and honest scholars have the same goal. They want to find out the truth. Simple as that. In whatever area they're pursuing. And sometimes it's not easy because there are interests that don't want to reveal the truth. So sometimes you have to use the Freedom of Information Act. Sometimes you have to delve into the scientific literature and find out, what's happening at all ends of the spectrum. The big picture about glyphosate is that it's connected to GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and the whole field of biotechnology and food, which began to become commercialized in the mid-1990s when the first products came out. I found it rather, I should say, confusing that we have laws in the books that say that if you put a foreign chemical into a food, you have to test that food with the foreign chemical to see if it's safe. But in the Reagan administration, they set up a commission headed by Dan Quayle. Some people may have forgotten Quayle. But he said he was head of the commission. And when the commission finished its work, they decided that when you put a foreign gene into a food, you don't have to regulate it. Foreign chemicals, yes, but foreign genes, you don't have to. And they considered that generally regarded as safe. Why? It was a mystery to me. Why? You take a gene from an Arctic carp, let's say, that has never met a lettuce plant, and you put the gene into the cell of the lettuce plant, and you grow up lettuce plants with the gene of an Arctic carp, and it's assumed to be generally regarded as safe. And I could never figure that out. But that was the policy that FDA had established in 1992, which came about from the Reagan administration. And that's been the policy since then. The Europeans had a very different policy. They said, no, if you put a foreign gene into a food product that it didn't have before, you have to test it for safety. So then they began testing the food with animal tests. That's the way we test chemicals. So the good news about genetically engineered food is that we don't know of any cases where anybody has been killed. No cases. The bad news is we haven't done research to understand what the impacts of this new regime of food is likely to be. I have to remember a few things. It took this country 50 years to regulate lead. And believe me, the lead industry did exactly what the chemical industry has done. They even gave small children coloring books to show Mr. Lead and how safe it was. Lead paint and lead in the gasoline. They had children's coloring books. And it took about that many years to find out that polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, was dangerous. And since the 1930s, they began to test DDT, and it was only banned in 1972, 10 years after Rachel Carson highlighted it in her book. So my estimate is that it takes between 25 and 50 years to ban or severely regulate a chemical in the United States. And that has to do with the system that we have. Drugs are a different story. When somebody submits a drug, it's assumed dangerous unless it's proven safe. So you have to prove the drug is safe. Sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes it's accepted, and then you find out it's dangerous after it's been approved. But at least the effort is there to prove it's safe. But chemicals, it's totally different. Many of the pesticides that are on the market today were approved 30, 40 years ago when the standards were very, very low. So they were grandfathered or grandmothered in. And to get rid of a pesticide takes a lot of regulatory action, which the regulatory agencies generally resist, because every time they take an action, the company that manufactures the product is going to sue the agency for not following some standard or other. So in the 1990s, Monsanto figured out a way to put some genetically modified material in corn and in soybeans, so that when they sprayed an herbicide on it, it would not kill their soybean or their corn. So, what's the purpose of the herbicide? It's to kill everything except your plant, because you don't want your plant to be competing with all the other things in the environment. You want your plant to get all the nutrients from the soil without competing with anything else. So Monsanto developed a seed called Ready Roundup seed. Ready Roundup. Roundup is glyphosate. And the seed has to be used with the herbicide, so you buy them together. You plant the seed, you spray the herbicide. And as you can imagine, the sale of herbicides around the world of Roundup, or glyphosate, started to skyrocket and became the most purchased and used herbicide on the planet. And that's where we get into now the problems of how safe is it. When I first looked into glyphosate with a toxicology colleague of mine 30 years ago, the data suggested it was pretty darn safe. The data suggested it. But I just did a little review just before I came here. And in the last 5 years, there were 800 new studies done on glyphosate. Wow, 800 new studies. Why didn't they do those studies when they first introduced it? What is it about the chemicals that they're introducing that they do most of the studies after the chemical has been on the market for 25 or 30 years? There are more studies done on DDT today than there was when it was first introduced in the 1940s and 50s. So I began thinking about this, and I was also thinking about, why are there two worlds out there about GMOs? There's one world that says it's absolutely safe, you don't have to worry about it. And the other is another world that says, I won't go near the stuff, I'll only buy organic. They don't talk to each other much. They only cite the science that they feel supports their view. It makes it very difficult to try to get some understanding of what the truth is. So I spent 2 or 3 years trying to delve into the science to find out what was true, what was untrue about genetically modified food, and hopefully that will be coming out in February with MIT Press, a book called GMOs Decoded. And I learned a great deal about delving into the science. First of all, I found out that the science was heavily politicized. Well, that's an awful thing to have to admit, because scientists are trained with this, they're all trained with the same kinds of books and techniques. And why should one scientific group say that this is a probable carcinogen and another scientific group say that glyphosate is safe and is not a carcinogen? I was fascinated by that because, I mean, after all, the world has only one science. So why would two agencies come to completely different points of view? And in the process of investigating it, I began to learn about how this can happen. Well, one agency, IARC, which you mentioned, is under the World Health Organization. They have very strict rules of conflicts of interest. Also, they will not accept an article for review. They don't do studies themselves. They review existing studies. They will not accept an article in their review for cancer if the article has not been published in a peer-reviewed journal. Wow. So I compared EPA's evaluation of glyphosate with IARC's evaluation of glyphosate, line by line. I found out that EPA had accepted 30 articles that were not published. They were from industry, and IARC did not. So you begin to see how two agencies can come up with different outcomes. And there were other things that bothered me. Very esteemed scientist who had done some work on GMOs, one in particular in the UK, a senior scientist who had many, many grants, published a number of books, published a paper in Science magazine, which, as everyone knows, is very difficult to get published in. And he was very eager to genetically engineer a potato with a protein that would prevent potato blight. He was from Scotland, and of course we know the Irish had terrible potato blights in history. And when he found out that his genetically modified potatoes harmed his animals compared to the controls, he was fired within a few days because the Prime Minister in England didn't want to hear anything about it. I've just never heard of anything like this. And then a French scientist also came out with a result which was not favorable to GMOs. He got his results published in an American journal, a very prestigious journal. And then the backlash came from Monsanto. And they set up their special committees to show that this scientist was a charlatan. He was from the University of Caen in Normandy, well-trained toxicologist, and he worked with a group. His paper was peer-reviewed and was published in this journal. Within a year, the editor-in-chief of the journal retracted his paper without his permission. That sounded very suspicious to me. But even more strange was the reason he gave for the retraction. Now, there are standards for retracting a paper. If you committed scientific fraud, your paper is going to be retracted. If you violated a fundamental ethical principle about treating human subjects or even animals, your paper is going to be retracted. But this editor-in-chief said, we're not retracting this paper because of any errors or because of any scientific misconduct. We're retracting this paper because the results were not definitive. I've never heard of anyone in the history of science, retracting a paper because the results were not definitive. You might as well retract 99% of the papers that are published. And I see that there's some people in the audience who clearly understand that. Results are never definitive. Anyway, I began to realize how politicized this area of science was. And that makes it extremely difficult to understand whether GMOs are ultimately going to be safe or unsafe. And one of the things that can happen when you put a foreign gene into a plant is it interferes with other genes, which means it's quite possible, if you get a genetically modified soybean, that some of its nutrients will be depressed, or microtoxins in the plant will be exacerbated. These are all possibilities, and they all exist in the literature. And there's only one way to find out, and that's to test it. But we have no testing regimes in the United States. None. So it's very difficult when you're a layperson and you don't spend 20 years studying a field to know what the truth is. So you try to depend upon other sources. You go to friends who are experts. You read an article in the New York Times and you hope that they're correct. You read The Guardian. You read Carey's article in The Guardian and you hope you're getting some truth. And one of the things I did was I went to the systematic reviews. These are people who spent 20 years studying a field, and they're given the opportunity to review the literature of the field. And I found 8 systematic reviews looking at GMOs and doing studies of all the studies that were done on animals. 4 of them said they were totally safe. 4 of them said there were all kinds of problems, and they caused damage to animals that were tested. So there you go. I have to remain skeptical and wait until we get a regime that allows us to fully test the GMOs as well as the RoundUp, and not only the glyphosate itself, but the additives that they put into the RoundUp. When they introduce a pesticide, they put in things into it to make it work more effectively. And I'll end up with this one story. In 2000, the city of Cambridge decided they were going to spray pesticides right down the streets of Mass Ave because of West Nile virus. The CDC said if you find a dead bird, draw a circle around it, a mile, and spray the entire area of the circle. Well, I want to know what they were spraying. The health department didn't actually know. Oh, synthetic pyrethroids. They used to come from flowers until they were synthetic. Then they were made in a laboratory. So I began investigating what they were spraying, having spent the day and the night during the spray in Concord, where they don't allow spraying. And I came back, and I found out that within the synthetic chemical that they test, there's another chemical that I found out is called piperonyl butoxide. No one would ever know this, and it's not tested, but it's a carcinogen. So they were using piperonyl butoxide in this pesticide. And why do they use the piperonyl butoxide? Because it depresses the enzymes in our bodies and in the insects' bodies for destroying the pesticide. So in other words, it makes the pesticides more effective because it depresses our body's system of attacking the toxin. So there you go. You have to be aware of all of these things. And I'm really happy to have known Carey, who's doing just an incredible job of disclosing these things and making the public aware of what we're facing. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure there are lots of people going to line up to ask lots of questions, but I have a few of my own. I do remember years and years ago, actually, reading an article in New Scientist in England. I used to work for The Guardian, and this was the first research that had been carried out on rats that had eaten GM corn, and it was done at a Scottish university, and I can't remember if it was Dundee University or Glasgow, but I do know that after this was published, showing these pictures of these rats with tumors, not only did all the evidence of the research disappear, but the researcher was fired within the week. And I remember that clearly happening because I thought, rather like Sheldon, this can't be happening. You can't just do away with the research and the researcher because she put something out that you didn't want to hear. So that was like at least 40 years ago. I remember that happening, 35 or 40 years ago. And so I can only imagine the amount of studies, if they did take place, where they've gone, where they've been suppressed, destroyed. And I'm very impressed that you were able to dig up what you were able to dig up within the Monsanto network to even publish the book. However, my next question, therefore, is how do we trust the regulators when all the regulators are being peppered with ex-Monsanto employees now? Today, the head of the Wildlife and Fisheries was appointed, and she's the ex-Monsanto employee. So it's like the foxes guarding the chickens. So how does the average man in the street get any kind of true sense of what's going on?
Gosh, is that for me?
Anyway.
How do you trust? You know, the head of EPA under the Obama administration was a student of ours at Tufts. She was Gina McCarthy, extremely trustworthy, you know, salt of the earth, honest, came up through the ranks. But she's in a very large agency with a lot of people. And unfortunately, sometimes these people can make friends in industry because they know that when they leave the agency, they're going to get a very nice job. Mm-hmm. The only thing you can do is to keep watch over what the agency does, to give them feedback every time they issue a new ruling. Let them hear from the public and watch their actions, watch their behavior. Make sure that they're not getting too friendly with industry. I have to tell you that in the Reagan administration, he appointed as the head of EPA Ann Gorsuch, the mother of our Supreme Court Justice. She lasted for 2 years and had to leave ignominiously because she opened up the EPA to undue influence on the part of industry. Yeah. Her toxic substances chief was sent to jail. So these things happen. And you've got to have journalists, you've got to have academics, you've got to have people watching the agencies, watching their move, and they can be doing the right thing because there are good people there. They're well-trained people. You just have to keep watch.
Yeah. I would add to that. That was a point I wanted to make, and I write about that a bit in my book. There are good people within these agencies, scientists who really are devoted to trying to protect public health and trying to do their jobs. There's a great memo from 1983 or 4 or 5, I can't remember now which it is. It's in the book. EPA toxicologists who looked at, this was an initial mouse study that actually Monsanto had done and submitted. It was a very long and robust study, and these toxicologists at EPA looked at it and said, well, this looks like it causes cancer, you know? And Monsanto said, you don't know what you're doing, you're not looking at it right, you're wrong. Anyway, this went on, and there's a memo where these EPA scientists say, it is not our job to protect you, Monsanto. It is our job to protect the public. Now, they ultimately failed in that endeavor, and they were overruled by superiors, and it was deemed not likely to be carcinogenic. which still is the position of the EPA today. But there are many good people, both in EPA and USDA. I write about some of them in my book, and these are people trying to do their jobs, but they are finding themselves censored by their bosses, by others. And it's not a Republican or a Democrat, it's not a partisan thing. It's been through, every administration, really. When the Obama administration came in, they tried to implement strong scientific integrity policies to protect scientists within these agencies so that they could publish and speak freely about research, even if it did not suit corporate interests. It's largely been a failure, according to surveys of public employees. In my book, I highlight a couple people who tried to be whistleblowers and basically are no longer with the agencies now that they work for. So it is a problem. I think the main thing I think we need to do, you might disagree, is get the money out of Washington, is change our system so that the powerful and the wealthy are not the people who our lawmakers are listening most closely to. They really should be listening to us. But that's not the way it works. And of course, they're the ones who are involved in pressuring the political appointees who are at the top of these agencies, and it trickles down. Mm-hmm. It's a corrupt system, just the way that it's laid out.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this is almost a very idiotic question. It's so simple. But I can't, for the life of me, understand how we went from a pretty decent farming system with rotation and land being laid fallow to this mythological Disney world where I remember Monsanto's initial pitch was that they were going to feed the world.
Right.
They were going to feed all the hungry people, and they could up, productivity and reap rewards faster, less loss through, crop being destroyed. And then the next thing we find out is all the poor Indian farmers that buy these GM seeds are killing themselves because the crop failed. They have monocultures, no diversity, and the crop fails. Now, I'm still puzzled over how they pitched this and how farmers even went for it. Was it the thought of these increased yields and profit margins, that they would put away all this good science and years, centuries of husbandry to invest in these stupid little crops that, if the crop fails, the entire crop fails?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty complex system, but the farmers, at least here in the United States, and the ones that I got to know and talk to, row crop farmers primarily are the ones we're talking about here, because the GMOs, Roundup Ready crops, are primarily soy and corn, alfalfa, cotton, canola, sugar beet are the main ones. There is not a Roundup Ready wheat, although Monsanto tried very hard to get a Roundup Ready wheat, and does in fact encourage farmers to spray Roundup over their wheat shortly before they harvest it. But to get to your point, farmers loved it. It was great for farmers because before this system, it is a lot of work to manage your fields and to rotate crops and to use cover crops and to use differential row spacing and to do all of these things that encourage biodiversity and soil health. Like, that's a lot of work. And the farmers who were using this Roundup Ready system, they could go get another job. I mean, it made it so much easier for them, and it worked great. Roundup worked great initially until weeds started developing resistance, and until soil health started year after year after year of glyphosate, year after year after year of no crop rotation, no diversity other than maybe corn, soy, really left the soil in sad shape, which made the crops more vulnerable to disease, it worked great at first, but after a long time, it didn't work so great. Mother Nature adapted to a certain extent with resistance, and so it doesn't work so great anymore. I mean, as I said, the farmers in my book, there are a lot of them still using it. There are a lot of farmers, they're still using it, but they're having to do other things. I was out in the field with a farmer in Kansas the other day who still uses it, still plants Roundup Ready corn, but he's also tilling his field now. Which, of course, one of the main reasons that you would buy Roundup Ready is because so you wouldn't have to till your fields. But he has to till his fields to control the weeds. So it's just not working. And as it's one of the things that Monsanto has introduced now is yeah, we know glyphosate's not working as well as it used to, so now we've introduced these new genetically engineered seeds that you can also spray over the top with dicamba, a different herbicide. So you can spray it with glyphosate and dicamba. And of course, that's created a whole new set of problems because dicamba doesn't stay where you spray it.
Yeah. I think you have to understand, every time they put a gene into a plant, they're not only just putting that particular gene in, they have to put a cassette. And when they do that, there's good chances that it'll interact with other genes. The only way you can know that is to actually investigate all the molecules that come out of the plant, all the DNA, the proteins, the metabolites, etc. So the more they pump into the plant to do more things, the more chance there is going to be that there's going to be other disruptions in the plant. We might not even notice it. It might take years. I mean, look, we've had junk food in America for 50 years. And now we're first learning how bad it is for children.
Yeah.
And you know, and for adults, but I mean children especially, because they're growing faster. But you know, sometimes it takes 50 years before you can study something. So when people say, oh, you know, we've had GMOs on the market for 20 years, they're fine, everybody's eating them. It's true. We are eating them unless we eat organic. But we don't know what other effects are happening because they haven't been fully studied.
Nobody tracks it, right? I mean, it's so ridiculous to say, you know, we've been eating GMOs for 20 years and, you know, that's proof that they aren't harmful. Nobody studied it. There's no tracking of, you know, your diet and your GMOs and what your health impacts are, and there's no correlation, there's no biomonitoring, there's none of that. So it's sort of
the most prestigious scientific body we have is the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. It's the most prestigious body. A certain amount of prestige to get invited to be in the academy, etc. Only the best of the best. And they published a 600-page study of genetically modified food. 600 pages. I had to go through it all. And they concluded that you can't depend upon animal tests to determine the safety of genetically modified food. They were not happy with animal tests. So what do they offer? Studying every single molecule in the GMO and comparing it to every single molecule in the non-GMO, and then figuring out if any of those new molecules can be hazardous. That's a very expensive system. Nobody does it. So here's the most prestigious agency saying, we can't even use animal studies.
Yeah.
They're not trustworthy, but the studies we can use, nobody does, and they're very, very expensive.
Yeah. And I mean, and one thing we do know, and this was one of the concerns that drove the move by consumers for GMO labeling, one thing we know is that these crops are sprayed directly with glyphosate. That's what most of them were designed to do. The main trait planted and cultivated around the world is herbicide tolerance. It's not yield, it's not drought tolerance, it's not disease resistant, it's herbicide tolerance. It's the main trait of GMOs planted around the world is designed to encourage the use of herbicide. Yeah. And what that means is we have these herbicide residues in our foods. And so for me, that is the primary concern. But it isn't only GMOs. Of course, glyphosate is used in conjunction with the production of spinach and almonds and wheat and oats and
you know, in researching the book that is coming out, I read a lot of the plant biologists, and one of their arguments was very interesting. They said, well, glyphosate attacks a certain pathway in the plant. It kills the plant by interfering with a certain pathway, which prevents the plant from surviving. That's how it works. Humans don't have that pathway. Therefore, glyphosate is safe for humans. That was the argument.
Right.
And I kept reading it over and over and over again. I said, I can't believe that. Any chemical that you take in your body can have multiple pathways, multiple effects. Some people take in the chemical and they're allergic to it. Other people are not. Other people might get stomach pains. I mean, there's so many different pathways that it was hard to believe that they could be using that as an argument that something is safe. But anyway, that's what we find in the scientific literature.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is emerging scientific research that indicates that this, it interferes with the shikimate pathway in plants, which inhibits their ability to develop these proteins that they need. But there is indication in new research that it may interfere with the bacteria in our gut, which is very important, of course, for a healthy immune system and other, health functions. And so while it wouldn't interfere
The
necessarily,
microbiome.
with the
Sure.
gut microbiota.
Yeah.
I don't know if questions are allowed.
Go ahead.
Get close to the microphone.
The point that Shelley made in passing was disturbing to me. Namely, we're going to have to wait for a regime to change before we can actually do this testing. And the testing isn't really the issue because it's never tested to be safe. They just assert that there's no evidence it's unsafe, it's dangerous. So we're never going to get anywhere on that plane, it seems to me. It's going to be a numbers game. It seems to me perhaps a more powerful logic is to amplify what you've already done by looking at the things that are parallel to it. You've looked at pesticides. In this case, herbicides. There are fungicides. There's a whole structure of modern agriculture that's built on what Shelley emphasized, killing everything else. This is an agriculture that's based on the principle of ecocide, right? Mm-hmm. Kill everything else except what we want at this moment, or what Monsanto and Bayer want at this moment. Further, there are other industries layered in on top of this, including fertilizer industry, right? And the agri-business industries having to do with tractors and harvesters and machinery. If you look at all that, it's all what you called pesticide-dependent. It's not just pesticide-dependent agriculture, it's petro-dependent agriculture. Right. Whether it's the machinery, the herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, whatever, it's petrochemicals. Now, the logic of petro-intensive agriculture is suicidal because you're getting more and more people on a finite planet committed to consuming fewer and fewer varieties of crops that are grown with greater and greater subsidies from a substance you know you're running out of, petroleum. That can't be a recipe for food security, right? So it seems to me you need to, in effect, nest your case within a larger logic about the suicide of petro-intensive agriculture. And you'd win it overnight. Not because you've proved that a particular pesticide is carcinogenic, but you've proved that the system is suicidal.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, certainly not sustainable.
Not sustainable, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you can comment about, I guess it leads a little bit from what Tim was saying about subsidies, the farm policy, USDA. Are we actually subsidizing and encouraging through the farm policy the use of all this stuff? And is there a way that you think we could
Right.
maybe reform some of that. That would help.
I was going to make that point, and I forgot. Thank you. Right. I mean, we subsidize very heavily this system now, with corn subsidies and soy and these row crops. We have roughly 1 billion bushels of corn every year that we can't sell, we can't eat, we can't use for fuel, and so it goes into a big storage elevator. So it's not that we aren't growing enough. It's that we, are subsidizing too much, essentially, and we are not subsidizing to nearly the degree needed foods grown without these pesticides and organic foods. And there is a group of farmers right now that I'm talking to in the U.S. Midwest who have a little tiny bit of money from USDA, and they are developing these strategies to grow crops without dependence on pesticides, and they're recording their data because USDA, even USDA, our own government, sees this as not sustainable, and that we do need to change our subsidies and our policies overall, but it's baby steps. People are becoming aware. But it's still a long way to go, I guess.
Just the farmers themselves and their families and their own health and what they just see in their communities and water,
Right.
The water supplies and just, is there a growing awareness of the problems that this whole
I think
system
there is. I mean,
creating?
particularly in Iowa, if you look at what's happening to the drinking water in Iowa because of the runoff of nitrates from farm fields and other agri-chemicals, it's almost like the lead in Flint. I mean, it's a real, or the contamination in Flint. It's a real health crisis developing in Iowa. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I would say people are becoming aware. You're seeing a movement all around the country, in localities where people are, going to their school boards and their city councils and saying, we don't want these pesticides sprayed in our parks. Where our kids play, we'll have dandelions grow. We don't care. Our kids roll around in the grass. It is notable, though, that in the Farm Bill, there is a provision in there that would preempt all of these local provisions and basically make it impossible for local governments and local communities to restrict pesticide use.
You might know me.
Yeah.
My name is Mary Mangan, and I published a book review on your book called Hogwash.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know.
it's on Biofortified for those of you who haven't read it yet. You should. And I've got a number of questions. Before we publish that, we sent you a
allowed one
list.
question. We've got people behind
well,
you.
Great.
Okay.
I had a list of 10 questions that Carey refused to answer when we published this, so let me ask you one question now, but please answer the rest of them when you have a chance, because that would be awesome. Why did you ignore all the science that was available? Because I laughed actually when you started talking today. You said you came to follow the science. How exactly did you ignore the breast milk studies, for example? And how come you didn't mention this large 2-year National Academy of Sciences major study on GMOs in your book at all? That's like ignoring the IPCC in a climate book. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Why would you ignore all that science?
The National Academy of Sciences study on GMOs, book isn't about GMOs, book's about glyphosate. For those of you who
We're
are
running out of
interested,
time.
so Mary, who I don't think is actually a book reviewer. I don't know, have you written a review of any other?
I have a PhD in molecular biology.
Have you written a review of any other book?
I read a lot of books, I read a lot of science. I have a PhD in
So,
molecular biology. Well, actually, I have 4 biology degrees.
She wrote this review and published it at a site called Biofortified. And in the Monsanto internal documents, they list Biofortified as a partner that they wanted to use to help discredit the International Agency for Research on
Excuse
Cancer.
me, I think you've had your question.
Mary.
There are 3 people, we have 10 minutes left. Would you mind letting somebody else come up to the microphone? Thank you very much.
And Mary
You could
is
distribute
actually
your pieces of paper at the
a
end.
really good example.
Thank you. Next person,
I
please.
didn't even get her question to me. What did she ask me?
Next person, please.
Yeah,
Thank
I mean,
you.
this is a great example of what happens to people, journalists, scientists, others, anybody who sort of publishes information that threatens the industry agenda. There are people like Mary who attack, try to discredit, harass, show up at public speeches, do this little dance, publish blogs and hate speech. I think she posts something hateful about me every day on social media. Is it really? Okay, well, I could be wrong because I don't read those sorts of things, but that's what I'm told. But anyway, it's a good example, but it doesn't just happen to me. It happens to lots of people.
Okay, next question, please. Lots of people want to ask a question.
So I have a question and a remark linked together. I think you touched on the fact that, unfortunately, worldwide, probably, I mean, hard to put a number on it, but maybe something like 99% of the GMO cultivated are...
I'm getting like a lot of echo. Maybe, I'm sorry.
You touched on the fact that worldwide, the vast majority of the GMO that are cultivated are indeed pesticide resistant. And since we're talking about GMO and the fact that it can be highly modifying the plant to just incorporate a new trait or a new gene, an exogenous gene, I think it's worth noting that towards agriculture, throughout centuries of agriculture, we have been breeding plants without any control of where genes, where they recombine and things like that. And actually legally, in Europe at least, if you do classical breeding, you don't have to test a plant. If it's viable and you just breed it through apple trees, the apple trees that you bred doesn't have to be tested to be toxic on it. So in a certain sense, bringing a single gene, whether it's from an Arctic carp or not, into an organism is not that crazy given the centuries and centuries of genetic modification that we did on crops. But that being said, I do think that it's extremely sad and extremely deceiving that 99% of the GMOs are pesticide resistant, because they would actually, we might end up at some point ban those, and we might ban GMOs as a whole instead of using it as a tool that might allow us to get out of the petro-dependent agricultures and things like that. So I do think it's worth putting these things in perspective and not just bash on it systematically.
So, and Sheldon would have a different view probably, just in terms of GMOs and the way I write about them in the book. And first of all, I don't think GMOs is one thing, right? I mean, we talk about them as they are, but they're not really, right? There are a range of different techniques and things that are engineered into plants. Like there's the papaya that's been engineered to be disease resistant, and that has been beneficial to a lot of farmers that grow papayas. There are plants that are developed to be insect resistant, to resist certain very harmful, rootworm and others and that has been helpful to farmers, although there are concerns about the toxins that are engineered into the plant. We have the Arctic apple, which won't turn brown, which people are excited about. I don't know, I want my apple to turn brown if it's old, I don't know, but maybe people don't. So I think there can be benefits from genetically engineered crops. Both DuPont and Monsanto worked on a drought-tolerant crop. DuPont's was not a GMO and Monsanto's was. Farmers got very excited about it. That would be a great thing, right? If you could grow corn without a lot of water. Now, the technologies didn't work exactly as well as the companies wanted them to, but still, they brought some value to farmers. The reason that I talk about GMOs and the point that I raise is the companies want to talk about feeding the world, and they want to talk about drought tolerance, and they want to talk about all these great things. But in fact, if you look at the data, their own data, again, the biggest class of the GMOs planted and cultivated around the world doesn't have anything to do with yield or feeding people or, preventing disease or fighting off insects. It has to do with selling more herbicide. And that's the only
stupidly
point.
Easy reasoning. Just
Okay.
providing a resistant gene. No, I didn't say your reasoning was stupid.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry.
we have 5 minutes. We have 2 more people.
I just
Would
said
you
it was
mind?
a very easy GMO to make. That's why you make a lot of money with that.
I'm a chemist who worked in the lab with carcinogens, including vinyl chloride, you might have heard of. And I find that chemists, there is kind of this mind shift of denial of the risks that you're putting yourself in. And I can imagine, I'm from St. Louis, and I knew a chemist that worked at Monsanto. And there is kind of a psychological element to it as well, not just kind of a devious profit-making, but I think actually in the lab, there's an interesting phenomenon going on. But I just wanted to ask you, I like the Environmental Health Network and Toxics Action, because I don't think that just one person can make a big difference in advocating for any kind of legislation. So I wondered if you had an organization that you liked, that you felt was effective.
The Center for Food Safety is one, I guess, that I have looked to a lot. They are essentially a legal group. They sue the government a lot, and they usually win. Although a lot, what they're doing is they find the pieces of the law that our government skips, basically, and they provide a lot of information and really do try to hold the government accountable, at least to follow the laws that are in place and regulations. And I don't know if you have a different one. I mean, there are a lot of others that try to provide information to consumers. Environmental Working Group is one that puts a lot of information out there that you can, get. What do you think? Pesticide Action Network puts out a lot of information about specific pesticides.
There are a few groups that have alerted society. For example, there was a genetically modified corn that was only supposed to be used for animals, and it was found in
Taco shells. Yeah.
And that was discovered by an environmental group that sent it out for study. So, these public interest groups can actually find things and cause agencies to push back and find people who are responsible for putting out things that were not supposed to be put out. So, yeah.
I don't know if that's helpful. Do you have any that you like?
Oh, I just mentioned the Environmental Health Network, and locally, Toxics Action, you might not have heard of, but they work in New England, and they were founded with the Woburn cancer cluster that was caused by chemical contamination. And so, W.R. Grace was the chemical company involved.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question because we have a book sale that has to start.
Thank you. Did anybody mention, are the Council for Responsible Genetics still in business? They were originally located right up the street here in Cambridge. That's just an informational thing.
I don't know.
With global warming was alluded to, Exxon apparently had there were internal documents that show that Exxon knew that global warming was caused by human-generated activity, and yet we're paying people to deny it, and that became part of some serious litigation, including attorney generals around the country, if I'm not mistaken. Is there evidence, if you haven't already spoken to this particular piece of it, is there evidence that Monsanto have internal evidence that what they're saying to the public is contradicted by their own knowledge of the research, especially about the disease dimension of this?
So there's not a smoking gun. There's not something where they say, yeah, we know this causes cancer and we don't care and we're going to kill people. No, there's nothing like that. In fact, I mean, what you do see is you see them being what some people might regard as cavalier about. So if they brought in, for instance, the scientist, Dr. Perry, who came in to look at genotoxicity concerns. A number of scientists around the world were doing studies that were showing these concerns, and they brought in this expert, Dr. Perry, and he looked at some of the information and said, yeah, it looks like there could be some concerns, and you should probably do something about it. And you see in their emails, they're basically saying, well, has he never worked with industry before? Like, what's his deal? Get rid of him. so you see that. You see them talking about, we haven't done the necessary studies to know whether Roundup is a carcinogen or not. We haven't done those studies. And in fact, the US government never required them to do those studies on Roundup. They did on glyphosate. They've never been required to do anything on the products that are actually used in the real world. Although, interesting sidelight, the National Toxicology Program did start just in the last year, finally, to do some testing on formulated glyphosate products for the first time. It's been on the market since 1974. They're doing it in stages. The very first stage showed that Roundup is genotoxic, which means it kills human cells, and it's more toxic than glyphosate by itself. But that doesn't mean it causes cancer. That's just one piece of research. So, did I answer your question?
Yes.
I don't know.
And the Council for Responsible Genetics, are they still around?
On the question of,
Are they? I don't know.
yeah.
I have no idea.
Okay, is this a really, really quick
You
question?
know,
Because we do
the
have to start.
litigation,
Books out.
the litigation is one of the great ways in which we get information. I don't know if the Enron litigation files, if they're open to the public, but that's how we learned about tobacco.
Right.
I have a friend, a historian, who studies litigation documents in the lead industry. He's testified all over the country. And now in California, they want a court order to get the lead industry to have to pay for de-leading. And only because of the discovery of these litigation documents did we really find out what was going on behind the scenes, what they really knew, and what they were trying to protect. And I have a question for Carey. Why did the courts allow the Monsanto litigation documents to go public? Couldn't they have put a seal on it?
Oh, most of them are sealed.
Most of them are sealed.
Most of them are sealed.
So the 10,000
we only have a
documents-
fraction of the documents.
So only a fraction. And look what we found.
The lawyers have several hundred more that they are planning to release
I
in the next
see.
round of litigation, and we'll be getting. And they're still doing discovery.
So there's still a lot more to discover about what has happened behind the scenes.
Potentially.
That was a good question for that.
Hi, I am a small organic farmer here in Massachusetts. And my husband and I are trying to start our own farm. We're working for farms right now. And one of the things people always say to us is like, how do you think you're really going to be making a big difference? You're kind of always put into this, niche of being very artisanal, and you'll never be able to feed the population with the way that you want to farm, which is more environmentally responsible and all that. And I was wondering if you guys had any way of activating the consumer to care more about where their food comes from, and how do you hope to change the food system without kind of getting more people to not just go for the cheap thing or not just go for the easy grocery store run, but to actually become involved in their food system a little bit more directly. So
Right, that's
it's a really
big.
huge question, I realize.
It's a
but
really
it was a
huge
quick
question.
one.
It's not a very short, quick question.
That's a huge question. But, there has been a big change. The organic movement is growing, at unprecedented rates. From the time I was a teenager, the word organic didn't even appear in a supermarket. And now, companies are trying to brand themselves organic. The government at that time didn't have organic standards. And there was a time when they wanted to make GMOs part of the organic standard, and the people just came out in droves in the internet, and this was under the Clinton administration. And they pulled back, so that right now, if it's organic, then it shouldn't be grown with GMO crops, and it shouldn't be sprayed with herbicides. And the more people begin to think that they want something without being sprayed by synthetic herbicides, the more that gets around. The organic movement in the United States is growing. More and more people are involved in it. That's the hope. The hope is that the marketplace, once the foods are adequately labeled And we have a labeling law for GMOs now, which has not even been in effect. It was a preemptive labeling law that the biotechnology industry pushed through Congress. And they still don't have official labels on it, but they're supposed to. It's been passed. But maybe to learn what's on the label, you might have to phone a number, or you might have to have a smartphone with some app on it or something like that. So it's not the best law.
Here's what I would say if you want to make people aware. Get the FDA or the USDA annual pesticide residue program data, which is a book like this, and just hand it to you. When you look at all of the different pesticides that are used in conventionally grown foods, and the insecticides and it's frightening. And when you see that 20 different pesticide residues of 20 different pesticides are, can commonly be found in a bowl of strawberries, or blueberries, for instance. When you know that, when you have that data and that information, I think it's impactful to people. And some people aren't going to care. I mean, some people still smoke cigarettes. Some people, drink wine, like me. I mean, it's about information. It's about making choices, I think, that are important in your own life, or that, fit into the context of your own decision-making. And but information is power. And it's out there. There's data out there. You saw, I'm sure, the study that came out that indicated that organic consumption of organic foods indicates a possible lowering of cancer risk, right? Did you see that?
I don't know how many of you remember Alar. This was a substance that was used on apple trees. It was sprayed on apple trees. The purpose of it was to get the apples to ripen at the same time, so they can bring in a crew of people very efficiently and pick the apples. What they didn't tell people was that Alar, or diminazide, caused cancer in animals. So one day, 1 month or whatever, an environmental group called the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, went ahead and had the Alar tested, and the scientists came out with a study that said that there would be 5,000 children with cancer because of this substance, Alar. They, instead of publishing the paper, they went to 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes did a story on Alar. And within a week, nobody was buying apples and apple juices. Nobody. Yeah. The whole country was, you saw these signs that say no Alar in the supermarkets. So I was doing some work on risk assessment, and they called me down to Washington to speak to about 1,000 people, many of them farmers. And so I got up there and I said, you folks do a lot of research on the color of apples. You spend a lot of money on trying to make sure that the apples you produce are going to be favorable to people's aesthetic interests. Why don't you do a focus group? Bring a bunch of people around a table and say, we've got a product here that we use on apple trees, and it causes cancer in mice. And your children drink an awful lot of apple juice. Should we put this on the market? Why didn't you do a focus group like that? And now, if you did, you wouldn't be in this situation where you've lost hundreds of millions of dollars because people don't want to buy apples and apple juice. Well, they were stunned that anybody would ask such a question. Yes, that's the things they should be doing. They should be testing the chemicals that they use in the apples and the agriculture, et cetera. And Alar was put off the market not by the regulators, but by the people.
Yeah.
Just by the knowledge. But how many times can you do that?
Yeah.
The most recent FDA report that came out this month shows 90% of apple juices contain pesticide residues.
Yeah,
now.
90%.
And this FDA chemist that I quote in the book says, always peel your apples, which I never did because I thought apple peels were so healthy, right? I made my kids eat them. He says, nah.
Yeah.
Pesticide, they don't wash off. They're in the skin, they're in the meat of the fruit. Peel your apples.
Okay, on that very cheery note,
Peel your apple.
for Halloween, no apples for Halloween, candy apples. I'd like to thank Carey Gillam, Professor Sheldon Krimsky for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.